second in command of all the army to Harry Tuzo, who was the general officer commanding. Number 2 was Robert Ford. Now, Robert Ford was the guy who sent the Paras to Derry. Paras weren't stationed in Derry. They were brought from Belfast, where they were the reserve battalion in Belfast. Belfast Brigade was commanded by a man called Frank Kitson. Sort of the name sort of will ring a bell with some of the more gnarled and grizzled comrades here present. Frank Kitson's man who wrote a book in the 1960s called Low Intensity Operations, which is the manual for counterinsurgency still being used by British forces. He gathered his expertise in Malaya. Now, Frank Kitson was a hard man, sort of the soldiers used to say. He had the Paras as his reserve battalion in Belfast. He and Ford between them, at Ford's instigation, sort of detached the Paras from Belfast and sent them to Derry. You see, and Saville says in his report explicitly that Ford could not have foreseen what was going to happen in the Bogside when he brought the Paras in. He says that absolutely explicitly, that General Ford, the fact that he brought the Paras to Derry, it doesn't mean he was in any way responsible. Now, this is quite simply untrue. It was foreseeable what the Paras were going to do in Derry. We know it was foreseeable because it was foreseen. It was foreseen by the Chief of Police in Derry, District Inspector Frank Lagan, who said repeatedly in the days leading up to Bloody Sunday to British Army officers, don't do this. He described it as madness. Moments before the Paras were actually sent into the Bogside, he was in the British Army headquarters, because Everton Barracks, about 2 miles away, standing alongside the commander of the 8th Brigade, man who was overall charge in Derry, Pat McClellan. We said to him, for God's sake, hold them, for God's sake, hold them, as the order was about to be given. And the case is given some dubiety or doubt about what the nature of the order was, as needn't concern us for the moment. So the Chief of Police knew. Not only did the Chief of Police know, garrison commanders in Derry knew and protested very vigorously. Now, sometimes when you look over the whole history of Bloody Sunday, there are a number of British Army officers who don't come out of it too badly at all. And one of them is Peter Wells. Peter Wells was the commander of the 2nd Anglians, was having garrisons in Derry, been in Derry for 18 months. And when he heard the Paras were being sent to Derry on the Thursday before Bloody Sunday, the Wednesday or the Thursday, I forget which, he went to McClellan, the brigade commander in Derry, and protested and said, you can't allow this to happen. And McClellan told him, well, you know, so there's nothing I can do about it. The orders have come from above. Peter Wells said to him, well, and Peter Wells said all this to the tribunal. He gave all this evidence. Saville knew all this. Peter Wells said to him, well, I'm going to protest to Lisburn. Lisburn was the headquarters, Army headquarters in Northern Ireland, only to be told by McClellan, that would do you no good. This order came from higher up. The higher up had to be Whitehall. It had to be from the highest levels in the British Army. If headquarters in Northern Ireland were not involved, if the order had come from higher up, or at least as we discovered after explicit sanction for sending the Paras to Derry, that it had come from higher up. Wells obviously felt very strongly about this, because what he did next is that he phoned an old friend who had been at military college with him, a man called Sir David Ramsbottom. The name rings a bell, because David Ramsbottom was subsequently Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons. You might remember he was sacked by Jack Straw for taking the job seriously, so I've been saying that the prison was a terrible mess. And if you're sacked by Jack Straw, there has to be good in you somewhere. You know? Ramsbottom at the time was the personal assistant, aide-de-camp, or however you pronounce it, to the General Officer Command, the Chief of the General Staff of the British Army, Field Marshal, Sir Michael Carver. And he was his personal assistant. Wells knew him personally, so he phoned him. Ramsbottom described all this in detail in his statement to the tribunal, and said to them, look, will you please intervene with Carver, with the Chief of the General Staff, and tell him that there's madness going on here in Derry. They're bringing the Paras to police a civil rights demonstration in this town in a few days' time. That message was given to Carver on the Friday morning before Bloody Sunday, and minutes before Carver went into a meeting of Edward Heath's cabinet. Ramsbottom said afterwards that he had no doubt that Carver would have said this to the cabinet. They knew not just that there was a possibility of massacre in Derry, but that very senior British Army officers felt very strongly about the ill-advisability, you put it mildly, of sending the Paras to Derry, and yet nobody intervened. So, and Saville makes no finding about that at all. Indeed, Saville says that the entire government and political establishment, both in London and in Belfast, couldn't have perceived them having a very low responsibility at all for the events. You see, Saville had found differently. Had he said even that this was a serious error of judgment, or had he said something stronger than that, could David Cameron have stood up in the Commons and said the British Army's been vindicated, this was just a few bad apples, and basically that's the thing, it's the bad apple theory applied to Bloody Sunday. Could he have said that? Saville had criticised the commander of land forces in Northern Ireland and above. David Cameron couldn't have said, as he did say in that speech, that the British Army is still the finest army in the world and that its reputation is not at all besmirched than the disgraceful actions of this small number of people, a bunch of squaddies and one undisciplined battalion commander. Saville hadn't said that they did it all. Cameron couldn't have made that speech, and people couldn't have said afterwards, well, you know, the British government has owned up to everything, so now let's be reconciled after 800 years of misunderstanding and strife. Couldn't have said that. Nobody could have said that. Take another day. He was in Derry on Bloody Sunday. Lieutenant Colonel Wilford, second in command, Captain Michael Jackson. He was 26 at the time of Bloody Sunday. And Jackson was on the ground in Roscoe Street in Derry when the shooting took place. All around him, there were rifles being fired, there were soldiers aiming at targets, there were people falling down, screams, shouts, and all the rest of it. In a statement to the tribunal, Jackson either couldn't remember any of this or said that he didn't see any of it. He saw nothing. He actually saw nothing happening all around him, but he did have a decisive role to play in the Bloody Sunday story. Because when we were over in London, down in the central hall of Westminster, listening to the military evidence, we had to go over to London because the soldiers said it would be too dangerous for them to go to Derry. Well, maybe so. So they moved the entire tribunal over to London at the cost of over 20 million quid, another explanation, another part of the explanation for the length and cost of the inquiry. Jackson gave evidence in April 2003 to the inquiry. In it, he said he didn't see anything, couldn't really help the tribunal, memory very hazy, didn't think he noticed anything that was going on. He finished his evidence, wasn't very interesting or controversial, scarcely reported. A couple of weeks later, Major Ted Loden appeared to give evidence. Now, Major Ted was handed on the witness stand, one of the family's lawyers handed him a shot list, that's what it was called, Loden's list, Loden's shot list. And this was a document, typewritten document, which purported to describe every shot fired by the soldiers on Bloody Sunday and the effect of the shot and why it had been fired. It was using sort of a six-figure map references. There was the soldier, there was the target, each target identified, rifleman, man with a pistol, man with a nail bomb, man with a petrol bomb, etc., etc. That was all in the shot list. There were 15 separate engagements, as it was called. And the story was that that is what happened on Bloody Sunday. That's the story that came out immediately afterwards. And then something very strange happened. Loden was giving evidence over 2 days. And the next morning, as soon as the tribunal opened, Saville's lead QC, a man called Christopher Clark, now High Court judge, Christopher Clark handed Loden another shot list. This one was handwritten. It was the typewritten one in script, in handwriting. He says that's the same document, isn't it? And it was, literally word for word, map reference by map reference, exactly the same as the typewritten one. And Clark said to him, that's your handwriting, isn't it? And Loden said, no, that's not my handwriting, that's Captain Jackson's handwriting. Mystery. How on earth did that happen? And Loden said, well, you know, what must have happened is that I wrote it out, and then Captain Jackson must have taken sort of my notes and written it out again, word for word, because it was the same as the typewritten one, word for word. And Clark said, well, why on earth would he do that? And Loden said, well, you better ask him, I have no idea. There's this mystery sort of about this, and Loden had described in great detail how this list had been compiled. He said that he had sat in the back of an armoured personnel carrier, like a little sort of makeshift headquarters that the Paris had set up in a place called Florence Avenue, just outside the box. And he described these soldiers one by one being brought to him. What did you do? I fired so many shots. Where were you? Identified on the map, and so forth. But this was in Jackson's handwriting, it turned out. Then something else amazing.